There's something most people with neuropathy never get shown. Not their average, not their lab report, their actual day. Because two people can have the same numbers and completely different symptoms. One feels stable, the other feels like it comes and goes. Burning one day, calm the next, then worse again. The difference is not random. It's not just damage. It's how stable the environment is throughout the day. And once you see that, neuropathy starts to make more sense. There's a pattern that shows up repeatedly in people managing neuropathy alongside blood sugar issues. Their A1C improves, sometimes even meaningfully. Their physician is encouraged. The numbers are moving in the right direction. And yet, the burning is still there. The tingling hasn't settled. Some days they feel like it's tolerable. Others, it's not. The pattern shifts without obvious cause, and the person sitting with these symptoms, they start to wonder whether anything is actually changing, because their body isn't behaving the way the numbers suggest that it should. That confusion is real, and it deserves a real explanation. Not a reassurance, not give it more time, an explanation grounded in how these systems actually work and why the assumption embedded in that question is only partially correct. The assumption is this: better numbers should produce better symptoms. That chain makes sense. It is partially supported by evidence, but it has a gap in it, and that gap is where most of the confusion lives. Let's start with what people believe, because the belief is reasonable. High blood sugar damages nerves. Lower blood sugar reduces damage. Less damage means better symptoms. Most people are told this implicitly or directly when they receive a diabetes or pre-diabetes diagnosis alongside with a neuropathy diagnosis. So they go to work, they change their diet, they take their medication, the A1C comes back lower, and they wait. The symptoms don't follow. The belief isn't wrong. Chronic elevation does contribute to nerve damage, but it is incomplete because it treats blood sugar as a single number rather than a dynamic process. And the body does not experience numbers. It experiences conditions in real time, continuously. That distinction changes everything. A1C is an average. It reflects the percentage of hemoglobin molecules that have glucose attached to them over approximately 2 to 3 months. It is useful. It gives a general picture of long-term glucose exposure. But it is a summary, and summaries lose information. Here's the part most people never hear. The body does not experience the summary. It experiences the moment-to-moment reality that created it. Two people can have identical A1C of 7.2. One has blood sugar that stays relatively stable throughout the day. It rises modestly after meals and returns to baseline. The other moves in wide arcs. It climbs steeply after eating, then drops, then climbs again. It may dip low in the afternoon and spike again before bed. On paper, identical. Inside the body, at the vessel wall, at the nerve fiber, not even close. To understand why, you have to understand what nerve tissue actually requires. Peripheral nerves are metabolically expensive. They are long, they maintain electrical activity across distances that, relative to their diameter, are extraordinary. They depend on a continuous supply of glucose as fuel, a continuous supply of oxygen, and they depend on that supply being consistent. Nerves are not designed for surge and deficit cycling. They don't have large energy reserves to draw on when supply drops. They operate closer to real time. When the metabolic environment becomes unstable, their behavior reflects that instability. This is the first layer, and it is where the assumption starts to break. When blood sugar rises rapidly, cells respond at the metabolic level. Glucose enters pathways that, under normal conditions, are tightly regulated. When it arrives in large quantities over a short period, those pathways become overloaded. The byproduct of that overload is oxidative stress, internal pressure at the cellular level that interferes with normal function. If this happens occasionally, the body manages it. But when blood sugar swings repeatedly, multiple times per day, over weeks and months, that stress accumulates faster than it clears. And over time, it begins to affect how cells function. That includes the cells that support nerve fibers and the nerve fibers themselves. That is the metabolic layer. Now, here's where most explanations stop. But the mechanism doesn't stop there. When blood sugar drops, not necessarily to dangerous levels, but meaningfully relative to where it was, the body responds again. Stress hormones increase. Their job is to bring glucose back up. But those hormones don't operate in isolation. They affect vascular tone. They shift blood flow. And this is where the circulation piece enters. Peripheral nerves are supplied by extremely small blood vessels called vasa nivorum. These are among the smallest vessels in the entire body. They are sensitive to stress hormones. They are sensitive to the inflammatory environment around them. When blood sugar swings and the stress response fires repeatedly, those small vessels are constantly being asked to adjust. What gets disrupted is not blood flow in the gross sense, it is the consistency of blood flow, the reliability of oxygen and nutrient delivery to the nerve. Nerves don't just need perfusion, they need steady perfusion. Inconsistent delivery means the nerves is periodically operating in a low resource environment. Then recovering, then being stressed again. That cycling matters because the nerve fiber gets a stable window in which repair can occur. There is an inflammatory dimension to this as well. The cells lining those small blood vessels are sensitive to glucose fluctuations. When sugar spikes rapidly, those cells generate inflammatory signals, even when the average glucose appears controlled. This includes increased formation of advanced glycation end products, which accumulate in vessel walls and nerve tissues over time. Now, what this means practically is this. A controlled average with high variability can produce a more inflammatory local environment than a moderately elevated average with stability. The A1C looks better, the tissue environment hasn't followed. This is not a subtle distinction. It is the core of why the symptom pattern doesn't track the lab results. Now, the final layer, the one that connects directly to what people feel. Peripheral nerves maintain their electrical state through ion gradients across the cell membrane. Those gradients are maintained by energy-dependent pumps. Those pumps rely on something called ATP. ATP depends on stable metabolic conditions. When the environment is unstable, when the nerve is periodically energy depleted, When mitochondrial function is impaired, those pumps don't run efficiently. The ion gradients become less stable, and when they shift, the nerve's threshold for firing changes. What that produces is a nerve that is easier to activate, more reactive, and more sensitive. The clinical term is hyperexcitability, and hyperexcitability in a sensory nerve shows up as, you may have guessed it, burning that feels disproportionate, tingling without a clear trigger, sensations that shift and don't follow a predictable pattern. The nerve is not imagining these signals, it is generating them. Because the environment it lives in is unstable, this is where the assumption finally breaks. The A1C improved, but the environment the nerve lives in has not stabilized at the same rate. There's also a time scale problem that creates a little bit of confusion. When someone improves their metabolic habits, A1C can change within weeks, but tissue environments change much more slowly. Oxidative stress does not clear immediately. Blood vessel function tends to restore very gradually. Inflammatory signaling settles over time. Nerve tissue repairs slowly. So there's a mismatch. The lab improves quickly, the tissue responds slowly. And if variability remains high while the average improves, then the summary has changed. But the environment has not. Let me show you how this looks in real life. One person improves their A1C from 8.4 to 7.1, but their day still includes spikes after meals, drops in the afternoon, and irregular evenings. Their worst symptoms show up at night. The average improved, the pattern did not. So the symptoms, they don't follow. Another person makes aggressive changes. Their numbers drop very quickly, but their symptoms get worse temporarily. Now, that can happen because the environment is shifting quickly, and nerve tissues prefer gradual change. Now, a third person is doing well on paper, but during periods of stress or poor sleep, symptoms flare. Not because of diet, because stress hormones increase glucose variability. Sleep disruption does the same. These patterns all point to the same thing. Neuropathy in this context is not driven by a single number. It is driven by a system. Glucose levels, blood flow, inflammation, nerve signaling, sleep, stress, muscle activity, all interacting. Lowering A1C addresses one part. It does not automatically fix the rest. What matters is the stability of the overall environment. So what does progress actually look like? Not just a lower number, a more stable pattern, fewer spikes, less dramatic swings, symptoms becoming more predictable, the worst days becoming less severe. That is a system stabilizing. There are markers beyond A1C. Things that you should look for are how you feel after a meal, what happens at night, are your symptoms tied to certain patterns? When the pattern becomes clear, the system becomes much more understandable. And when it becomes understandable, it becomes more meaningful and more manageable. There are also important boundaries. This does not mean variability is the only cause of neuropathy. There are other forms: autoimmune, inflammatory, mechanical. This does not mean reducing variability reverses all the damage, and it does not replace actual medical care. But it does explain something many people experience. A1C tells you your average, but your nerves don't live in your average. They live in your day. They live in the spikes, the drops, the shifts your body has to keep up with to adapt. And adaptation has a cost. When glucose is unstable, the environment is unstable. When the environment is unstable, the nerve becomes unstable. And unstable nerves don't behave predictably. That's what you feel. So lowering your numbers, it does matter, but stabilizing your pattern matters just as much, because stability reduces stress, and reduced stress allows the system to function more normally. That is the difference between improving a number and improving the environment the nerve actually lives in.